Okay.
It's all yours.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Lynn Ann, for your work in helping to get the um, SUNY Historians Network webinars up and running. We really appreciate all the work you've done and the labor you've put in on getting this rolling. My name is Michael Kramer. I'm a professor in the history department at SUNY Brockport and the director of the SUNY History Lab, which is sponsoring this pilot series of the SUNY Historians Network webinar series focused on U.S. history this spring. So thanks to all of you for attending this first of our series of 4 webinars coming up, one each month through June of this semester, of this year. A few program notes before I hand it over to Dr. Masarik. We want to thank the Center for Professional Development and Lynn Ann for assisting with the webinar. And we want to thank SUNY for an innovative instructional technology grant, which has helped to support the development of the webinar series. Our next webinar will be on April 25th from 5 to 7 p.m. and is titled Beyond the City, Replacing the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in New York State and Beyond. Presentations of an NEH-funded SUNY-centric project led by Dr. Kevin Sheets and Dr. Randy Storch of SUNY Cortland. They will be joined on April 25th from 5 to 7 p.m. by a number of participating SUNY faculty who've been involved in a project on space and place in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in New York, and looking out from New York State to the rest of the country and the world. In the chat, you can find a link to register for the upcoming webinars in the series, or you can search on the SUNY History Lab on your browser and access the page through the SUNY History Lab link there. So we hope you'll join us for these upcoming events in April, May, and June. More information about them is on the website. Today, Dr. Masarik will be presenting. I'll introduce her in a moment, but one more note of our protocol. We ask that you enter any questions you might have during the presentation in the Q&A function on Zoom rather than the chat function. And you can put in your question if you would like us to turn on your microphone and have you ask the question directly, or you can make a note if you'd simply like for me to read your question out loud. It's up to you which you would prefer. So on that note, let me introduce Dr. Elizabeth Garner Masarik. She earned her PhD and MA from the University of Buffalo and her BA from the University of Texas, and is currently an assistant professor of U.S. history at SUNY Brockport, where she specializes in U.S. women's history and gender. She's the author of The Sentimental State: How Women-Led Reform Built the American Welfare State, published by University of Georgia Press in 2024. Congratulations, Elizabeth, on the book. She is a founder and co-producer of the award-winning podcast, Dig, a history podcast, available on all your typical podcast outlets. And she is the co-author of the forthcoming book, Spiritualism's Place: Reformers, Seekers, and Seances in Lily Dale. She was the recipient of the A. Elizabeth Taylor Article Prize for the Best Article on Women's History for 2019 from the Southern Association of Women, and is currently the inaugural recipient this academic year of the Dr. Virginia Radley SUNY Fellowship, which focuses in particular on women's history in New York State. Her presentation today comes from the research that she's been working on, in part, through the fellowship, and is titled Voting Rights and Voices from Beyond, Exploring Suffrage and Spiritualism. So please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Garner Masarik.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me today. I've put together something kind of loosey-goosey. This is a research talk. I'm still very much in kind of the thick of things. I've been bouncing around to archives this year. This fellowship has really just allowed me to fast track research, and so I'm in the process of sifting through a lot of stuff. So just going to kind of keep it light, tell you what I've been up to, and happy to hear any questions as we go along. So as Michael said, this is me. I am an assistant professor of history at SUNY Brockport. This is the cover of my book that is coming out April 1st. So like, what is that, Monday, something like that? So first book, so super excited. Love that cover. As he mentioned, I am the Dr. Virginia Radley SUNY Fellow this year. And so that is what has provided me the funds to work on my current project. So Sentimental State here is my first book. And one of the questions I asked in that book was, what makes people engage in reform movements, right? Like why would you get off your couch and go out and work to pass laws that are going to help other people, or work to raise funds that are going to help other people? And that's always kind of one of the questions I have. And that question really kind of follows me into my current project. Now, my current project also comes out of another project I've been working on. Michael mentioned that I am a producer for Dig, a history podcast. We've going on our 6th year now. And about 5 years ago, Mike McGandy from Cornell University actually approached us about doing a kind of crossover. He wanted to do a book and a podcast kind of crossover. So it was this experimental thing that we were doing. And so we went to Lily Dale, New York, which is a spiritualist center, still active. It started in 1880. It's about an hour south of Buffalo, but it's still very much a spiritualist center even today. And so we did this academic kind of trade press crossover where we went to Lily Dale, in our podcast historian personas, so to speak, and we wrote a history book, but kind of melding past with present. And so in that co-written book, which is Spiritualism's Place, which you see here, that's coming out in October through Three Hills Press, which is the trade press for Cornell University. And in that book, I wrote a chapter about women's rights movements, or the women's rights movement and spiritualism, and how they are connected. And in doing that chapter, I realized that there's just way more that needs to be done. I was just really scratching the surface. And so that's where my project comes from. So here are some pictures from that chapter from Spiritualism's Place. This large picture here on the, I don't know if that would be your right or left, but the single picture, that is Marion Skidmore. She was one of kind of the founding matrons of Lily Dale, and she's a huge proponent of women's suffrage. In the colored picture in the middle, that's her holding the flags of Colorado and Wyoming, who were the only 2 states who could vote or who had equal suffrage at the time of that picture is being taken. And there's a little red dot over somebody's head, and that's actually Susan B. Anthony's. That's Susan B. Anthony in that picture. And then the far picture, the women sitting around a picnic table, the woman with the fabulous hat is Anna Howard Shaw, who was the president of the National Association of Women's Suffrage, NAUSA, for many, many years. And that's her at Lily Dale as well. And so these are kind of understudied crossovers of the early women's rights, early suffrage movement with spiritualism. So I was talking about that in that chapter. And like I said, just kind of realized that there's a lot to go, or a lot more to do. So the OG that really kind of talked first, or spoke first, about this connection between the early women's rights movement and spiritualism is Anne Braude. And she wrote Radical Spirits, came out in 1989, and underscored how integral spiritualism was to the 19th century women's rights movement. A lot of people did not like that she was tying the women's rights movement to spiritualism when this book came out, because they felt it kind of sullied the women's rights movement, so to speak, which actually tells you a lot about how people think about spiritualism. But what Browdy did was really tie spiritualism and women's rights to kind of what else was going on in the 19th century during that time. And spiritualism itself comes out of this period, this space and place that we call New York's burnt over district, roughly like 1819 to 1840. It's again a little loosey-goosey with the dates, but it coincides with a time of the Second Great Awakening, which is also a point in American history of great religious revivals. And in New York State, in Western New York in particularly, these kind of religious revivals are very much the thing to do. And there are lots of experimental and kind of, outside of the box, so to speak, of Protestant, Christian adjacent religions that are popping up in the area. And so the area gets this name, Burnt Over District. It's actually coined by Finney, one of these kind of traveling itinerant ministers that's going around the area. It's thrown out there kind of as a slight to the people, but it ends up really taking hold, basically meaning that the area is so aflame with these religious revivals that the area is completely burnt over, right? So we think of it as just a space and a place that is very ripe for these kind of new religions coming up. And so you have religions like the Latter-day Saints, right? Mormons start in this area, the Millerites who become the Seventh-day Adventists, lots of different kind of groups in this area. What else is going on is something that, again, historians kind of grapple over. Is it the market revolution? Is that the communications revolution? Whatever we want to call it, there is a change happening in kind of commerce and in communication, and things are happening a lot faster in this kind of early part of the 19th centuries, like 1820s, 1840s, 1850s, right? So you've got the Erie Canal that opens up in the 1820s and makes what used to take months now take weeks or days for travel. You have steamships that can now go upriver instead of only down. You have a telegraph, right? And the telegraph is very important for this particular study because if anybody's familiar with the telegraph, it uses Morse code, right? It's tapping, tap, 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 which gives a person a signal which transcribes into sounds and letters and phrases, right? And this seems very magical to a lot of people if you think about it. Again, information that could take weeks, months to get from one place to another. All it now has to do is somebody in a room has to tap on this little thing, and thousands of miles away, somebody's going to hear those taps somehow and understand what they're saying, right? And that seems magical. You see a picture here. It's a spirit telegraph, right? Where are these words going into the ether over these electrical lines, and how do they become form again? Like that's really hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. And in the midst of this kind of religious fervor and upheaval with communications and transportation, we have the Fox sisters, who in 1848 in Western New York began to have communications with the spirit of a dead peddler that is in their house. To make a long story short, very serious people take the sisters very seriously, and they begin to do tests. They ask spirit questions. Spirit answers with a certain amount of raps or knocks on the door or walls or table, which is very similar to what I was just explaining with the telegraph, right? And Isaac and Amy Post, who are very important, very well respected, very connected, reform minded people in the Rochester area. They hear about the Fox sisters' ability to talk to spirit. They go, they check it out. They think, yes, this is legit. They bring the Fox sisters to Rochester, have them do these tests in Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York, and it spreads from there. And spiritualism as a religion begins to explode. Now, the Fox sisters are not the only people that are doing this, nor are they the only people who are talking or thinking or writing about speaking with the dead or speaking from the beyond. That is in the ether as well. And there are people who are working with mesmerism and animal magnetism and things like that. So they're not necessarily the originators of the idea, but their kind of celebrity of being able to talk to spirit, being able to talk to ghosts, really kind of catapults this desire of people to speak to the other side, to kind of scientifically analyze, can we speak beyond death? It kind of catapults it into popularity, I guess, so to speak. And remember, I just want to reiterate, right? Like with the telegraph, like it's not. Some people are very much like, ooh, spooky, whatever. But it's also this is a point in time where, you know, people really are wondering, okay, if we can send communication across, electricity lines, if we can, now get from place to place in days when it took months, why can't we speak to the other side, right? So it is like a proper question that people have. Now, this ties us back to kind of Browdy and her original thesis about the interconnections between the women's rights movement and spiritualism. So here on the left, we see this woman. She's sitting, kind of laying on the couch or whatever, and she's supposed to be in trance. Essentially, spirit, or the spirit of a loved one or somebody who has passed on, is coming through her, and she is able to speak in that person's voice authoritatively, right? And so a lot of the times, young women would either do readings in kind of a private setting like you see in this picture, but oftentimes they would stand on stage in front of a promiscuous audience, meaning a mix of men and women, and they would speak authoritatively on particular subjects. But what gave them the kind of right, so to speak, to speak authoritatively was that they were channeling the spirit of someone else. And oftentimes that was a famous man, right? So Benjamin Franklin was kind of a popular person to come through. George Washington would come through a lot. But what it did is it allowed women to be literally a medium between God, between heaven, between the afterlife, and general people, right? And so here you have a picture of a preacher in a pulpit, right? There's a very strong hierarchy there: male, untouchable, learned. And so spiritualism allows, you know, uneducated young women an opportunity to speak on issues that people at the time found very important. And so that's really kind of Browdy's central thesis. Again, one of the reasons why women's rights and spiritualism really worked hand in hand together, because spiritualists are kind of breaking down the hierarchy of the male leadership, church leadership. They are preaching women's rights. They're preaching women's equality in marriage. Some of them are even preaching against marriage because it's a form of prostitution. So really kind of radical ideas about equality between people, between sexes, between races. And it breaks down a lot of those hierarchies that traditional Christianity has in place. So Browdy and others argue that this separation, or the close ties between spiritualism and suffrage, really break down in the 1870s for a variety of reasons. One reason is that women began to be able to speak more in public, and it's not so taboo for women to speak in public as much going later into the 19th century. Another reason is there are a lot of kind of exposés of certain spiritualists who are committing fraud. Victoria Woodhull does not help the spiritualist kind of cause when she comes onto the scene and then blows up pretty quickly. And so a lot of historians, Browdy included, argue that spiritualism and suffrage really kind of lose those ties around the 1870s. And so that's where my project picks up. Very long-winded way to go about that. But the women that I'm following actually pick up really right around the time 1870, right at this time where suffrage and spiritualism are supposed to be kind of drifting apart. And so I follow a number of women who are spiritualists and ardent suffragists, who aren't necessarily well known, but the more that I find out about them, the more I'm surprised that we don't know that much about them, because they actually seem kind of important. And so that's what I'm doing with this study. Is I'm kind of, number one, bringing out some names that have been kind of lost to history, but also asking, okay, well, how integral was spiritualism into the late 19th and even into the early 20th century? And also, why does it matter? Why should we care, right? And these are questions that I'm asking and kind of still grappling with. So in the picture here, I have Carrie E.S. Twing and E.L. Watson, or Elizabeth Lowe Watson. Both of these women I learned about when I was writing the chapter for the Lilydale book. So they both have close ties with Lilydale. They are both Western New Yorkers. Twing is born and raised in Chautauqua County. Watson is born in Ohio, but quickly moves to Western New York, lives a lot of her life here in Western New York, and then hightails it out to California later, which we'll talk about. So these are two women that I'll talk about today and kind of give you a little backstory on them. But just to give you an idea, these are some other women who are also ardent spiritualists and are really important in the suffrage movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. So Nora Babcock, she's also a Chautauqua County resident. She's a press secretary for NAUSA from 1899 and 1906, and then stays, very important in the suffrage movement from then on. Mary Seymour Howe, very high up in NAUSA and the WCTU and the National Council of Women, which is an international organization. Elizabeth Stewart Philip Ward, she is a best-selling author. She wrote, her most famous book is The Gates Ajar, which comes out right after the Civil War. It's about spiritualism and kind of finding the spirit of her deceased brother. But she goes on to write tons of work. And actually, I just learned this not that long ago, funded the New York like the downtown New York headquarters for NAUSA, like paid their rent for forever. So these are all, you know, these three women plus the other two, and then some more that I have, are all practicing spiritualists, you know, well after the fact that it's, you know, not the cool thing to do. And you know, I just kind of want to know why and how and why is this not common knowledge? And so just kind of digging into this question, I guess. So I'll go back to Elizabeth Lowe Watson. This is a younger picture of her. So this is her with the white curly hair here, and then this is a picture of her younger. She begins to talk to spirit at age 7. So it's about 1850 when she starts talking to spirit. So that's about 2 years after the Fox sister. She's in Leona, which is in Western New York. It's very close to Lilydale. And she is taken by her father throughout Western New York and kind of the northeastern region all over, and is taken around as a spirit medium. So would go to different spiritualists camps and meetings, and would go into trance, and spirit would speak through her, you know, to audiences. In 1862, she's about 19 or 20 years old. She marries Jonathan Watson. And Jonathan Watson was a millionaire who struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And he struck oil because spirit told him where to dig his oil wells. And there's a whole historiography that I'm just diving into about the early oil industry in the Gilded Age, how many of them did not trust, you know, scientists, geologists. You know, it was a very baby field at the time anyway, and many of them actually were using spirit mediums to tell them where to dig their oil rigs, or whatever, dikes, whatever they're called. So anyway, so she marries Watson in 1862. They move to Rochester, New York, living in the super posh Cornhill Third Ward area. Can't figure out exactly if her house is still there or not, but found them in the census. And when neighbors had houses that were, you know, valued around like $1,200, theirs is like $38,000. So definitely living very large while they're living in Rochester. And she is friends and has correspondence with Amy and Isaac Post throughout the 1860s and early 70s. Again, Amy Post is that person who brought the Fox sisters to Rochester, New York, and kind of gave them credibility. She's also very much in the abolitionist movement. She's one of the signers of the Declaration of Sentiments. She's friends with Frederick Douglass. So very, very, very important, well-connected and serious woman. And so Libby, Elizabeth Lowe Watson, she signs all her letters as Libby, and Amy Post are friends. Around 1878, she leaves Jonathan. I haven't figured out why. Jonathan's papers say that his young buxom bride took all his money and ran off to California. Her papers are a little, you know, quiet about that, say that they both maybe went to California and then Jonathan went back to Pennsylvania. But something was not right in the marriage. There's hints that he was spending money pretty wildly, not being very smart about the money. Sorry, got an alarm going off. And so she, for whatever reason, I haven't figured out exactly why, leaves and goes to California. But she's coming back often to Western New York to speak, to meet up with friends. This is a newspaper article. She came back. Yeah, this is from 1898. So she's speaking at the 50th anniversary of spiritualism in Rochester. People at this meeting are Carrie Twing, who I'll talk about in a second. Susan B. Anthony's at this meeting. Lots of big names are coming to this. But so she's kind of bopping back and forth between California and Western New York. This is a picture of the Metropolitan Temple in San Francisco. She's leading a congregation here of spiritualists in San Francisco. So I wanted to kind of show you the size of this picture just to give you the magnitude of what she's doing. You know, she's not just meeting in people's parlors, you know, she's leading congregations in buildings that look like this, right? She's in all the California newspapers, you know, and is a pretty big deal and becomes taken pretty seriously. She comes back in to Western New York in 1880. She's one of the founders of Lilydale, New York. And so she's really just kind of traveling all over between New York, California. She spent some time in Australia. This is a thread I'm pulling right now. When I was in California, I found out that one of the Stanford universities, one of those brothers was a spiritualist, and he ended up going to Australia. And Libby spent a 4-month tour speaking about spiritualism in Australia, which I have not been able to find any, like, you know, writings about what she did there or anything like that. When I was in Stanford, I was trying to get into that brother Stanford papers, but they were having a TA strike the week I was there, so I wasn't able to get into those papers. So I'm hoping maybe I can pull on that thread. But you know, regardless, she's traveling the world, speaking on spiritualism. And then all of a sudden, she becomes the president of the California Equal Suffrage Association. So I don't know if you can see this, it's kind of blurry, but here, kind of in the middle here, you can see Mrs. Elizabeth Lowe Watson is the current president. So she's the president from I think I have my dates right, 1908 to 1913. And 1913 is the year that California passes equal suffrage. So that's the year that women get the vote in California. And she is the president of the state association, which kind of just blows my mind, because without digging into her as a spiritualist, she is not mentioned very much at all in any of the suffrage papers or, you know, books. Like she might just be mentioned by name, like Mrs. Watson here and there, but very just kind of superficially and off the cuff. And I always when I put the two together, like, oh, here she is, this major like spiritualist speaker, and then she becomes president of the California Equal Suffrage Association. Like, what's the disconnect? Like, did people not like her? Were people embarrassed by her? And the more I get into her paperwork, I don't think that is the case. People loved her. She seemed to be very well connected, very easygoing, very, you know, nice. I mean, for lack of a better word, but like good at her job, right? And good at what she's doing, and a very serious person. So it's still a bit of a mystery to me how I don't know, like what the disconnect is. And so honestly, that is what I'm working on right now. I recently unearthed a unpublished manuscript by her, which I'm sorry to say I have not gotten into yet. So I'm hoping that gives me some more kind of insight into her life and the connections she made. So I don't know. That's kind of a you know, open-ended part of this project at the moment. But her life gives it's nice because she lives a nice long life. So this is her at a orchard that she bought in California. She named it Sunny Bray, and this huge oak tree here is called Temple Oak. And on Sundays she would have sermons out here, for, you know, anybody who wanted to come and listen to her preach. And she stayed a spiritualist until her dying day. So she never, you know, renounced spiritualism or anything like that. Like she continued to be a spiritualist. And Anna Howard Shaw and Susan B. Anthony and all the other major, you know, suffrage women, when they were going out to California, particularly in the 1890s, 1896, when California had its first referendum for women's suffrage, you know, Libby or Elizabeth Lou Watson, hosts them here at Sunnybray under Temple Oak. So this is a picture of her. I think this picture is taken in 1923. Again, I'd never seen this before. I found this at Berkeley. I found a whole cache of letters that she had written to and from other suffragists much later in her life. So she passed in 1927. So she lived a really nice long life, well into her late 80s. And so it was great to have some papers of hers that give me kind of an idea of what her life was like after, suffrage, and did she ever renounce spiritualism or have any regrets or anything like that. And again, sorry, I'm still digging through it, so I don't have a lot of answers for you, but it's great to have kind of a full life that I can view her. I mean, when you think about her starting in the 1850s, traveling around Western New York as a spirit medium, as like a 7, 8, 9-year-old, to owning this fruit orchard in Southern California, and being president of the Women's Suffrage Association. It's quite a wild story. Not to even mention the rich oil tycoon husband that she leaves. Like it's a great story, and I'm still like pulling on the threads. So I will go on to the next one. I'm sorry, it's weird. I feel like I'm just kind of talking into an emptiness. So anybody like speak up if I need to stop or slow down or anything like that. So the next person I'll talk about a little bit is Carrie Twing. So she, again, is from Chautauqua County. She spends her whole life, most of her life in Westfield, New York. She experiences spirit a little older. She's an older teenager when she experiences spirit, and she becomes a writing medium. So there's different types of mediumship. Some mediums will get spirit, and it will write through them. Right. So she is a writing medium where the spirit basically kind of takes over her hand, and she writes things. Whereas Elizabeth Lowe Watson, spirit kind of overtook her whole body. Twing, she is a teacher in the 1860s. She gets married kind of semi late in life in 1870, to a man who is from Westfield, knows she's a spiritualist. She begins speaking on the spiritualist circuit in the 1870s. So by this point in time, she's like a grown adult on the spiritualist circuit. And when I say this spiritualist circuit, particularly like 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, we're really talking about camps that are permanent settlements that for summers or winters, depending on where you are, whether you're in the north or the south, people would go and they would build cottages or rent cottages at a camp, and would stay there for weeks or months at a time, go to lectures, go to lyceums, and people would travel to and from the camps to speak on a variety of subjects. One of those, of course, being women's rights and women's suffrage. And so you can find her, or I was able to find her through different kind of programs from some of these camps, through newspapers. Newspapers have been really helpful in me kind of fleshing out her life, particularly the New York State Historic Archive papers. Those have been really helpful. So she's speaking on the circuit. She's doing private readings for people, right? So people will pay her to speak to a loved one or something like that, and she'll write what the loved one says, to the person. But she's also speaking on current events. So she's always speaking about women's rights at these group meetings. And she is also a member of the Grange, which is the patrons of husbandry. Her and her husband both are very high up in the Grange. And she is also a member of the WCTU and is an officer of the Chautauqua County WTCU. She writes her first book in 1880. This is interesting. So I put in quotes. She writes. So she does it as a spirit medium, and she channels Samuel Bowles, who was the editor of the Springfield's Courier, I think it was. It was a kind of a popular newspaper at the time. And it's an interesting book because the only place that her name is ever even mentioned is right at the beginning. It says written through the mediumship of Carrie E.S. Twing. Otherwise, everything, like even the dedication you can see here, it's written like Samuel Bowles is just speaking. So this, of course, is kind of one of the elephants in the room, so to speak, when you're thinking about doing research with this type of thing. Do I take this as Carrie's voice? Do I take this as Samuel Bowles' voice? And as I'm writing, I'm kind of explaining how I'm using this. Nothing that Carrie says or nothing that Samuel Bowles says through the mediumship of Carrie in this book is out of the ordinary for anything that Carrie Twing has spoken about publicly. So, for example, spiritualists are very anti-death penalty, anti-capital punishment. So there's a whole chapter in this book about being anti death penalty. There's portions on the equality of the sexes, things like that. So the way I take it is there's nothing that she is putting through as a medium that she does not kind of support herself, so to speak. And I'm looking at the time, so I'll kind of speed up here a little bit. But again, she's she's very high up in the Grange. She's a paid speaker for the Grange, so the Grange is sending her to all kind of places all over the Northeast to speak on women's suffrage, to speak on the Grange and Grange kind of issues, which is kind of farming issues. So I spent a lot of time at Cornell University going through all those Grange records. Very low political content. It's really farming heavy, right? Like talking about like proper farming techniques, things like that. And I forgot to mention that her and her husband Herbert are vineyard owners in Chautauqua. So one of the first people who start growing Concord grapes in that area, which is something that I'm trying to square with her being very high up in the WCTU, right? Because grapes usually are used for wine. And I don't quite have an answer for that yet. So just, again, something to kind of dig around with. But as she is, high up in the Grange and the WCTU, she's also headlining New York State suffrage meetings. So this is from the 1899 New York State suffrage conference, and she's the opening night was the Thursday night, so the page previous would have showed that night. And as you can see here, she's got top billing with Lily Devereaux Blake, who's the president of the New York State Women's Suffrage League, Harriet May Mills, another kind of bigwig. Then you got Mrs. Carrie E.S. Twig, and then Susan B. Anthony. So she's right up there with the top four, and all kinds of like suffrage paraphernalia and things like that are advertising the meetings that they're going to have. They have Carrie E.S. Twing just mentioned just like that. They don't have to like say, oh, Grange lecturer or spiritualist lecturer. Like, people just know who she is, and so they can just put her name and that's enough, which again I find kind of fascinating, because I had never even heard of her until I started looking into Lily Dale in that other book that I was working on. She goes on to write a few more books. So Gem, The Touch of an Angel Mother is one of her kind of more famous books. This is a little more, it's by her. So she's actually writing as herself, not as a medium, but it is talking about spiritualism and about the life beyond. And down here, one of the dedications: because my own children are all under the tender care of the angels, and my heart is hungry for the love of the young, I most lovingly dedicate this book to the children of the world. And so very much kind of going back to my first book, The Sentimental State, this kind of brings again that question that I like to ask of, well, why are people doing this? Why are they, doing this work for people? And one of Carrie's kind of motivating factors is she's lost 4 of her children, right? She's never, she's never been able to be the mother that she wants to be, and so she wants to then mother the world, right? Kind of this maternalist outlook that she wants to give that love to the world, while the angels are watching over her own loved ones. And it's again, she talks about being able to talk to her children who are in the other world, and it's a solace to her because she knows that she's going to see them on the other side eventually. And this is just, she's down here in the front here. I think this is from a camp meeting in Michigan. And then in 1903, she bought a cabin in Cassadaga, Florida. So Cassadaga, Florida has a sister spiritualist camp to Lilydale. And so people from Lilydale would go down to Cassadaga, Florida in the winter, and then they'd go up to New York in the summer. And so she buys a cottage in Cassadaga, Florida in 1903 and begins spending her winters down there. So that's her number 9. And so that's been nice because I was able to go down to Florida a few weeks ago and got hooked up with some people who are just storing archives in their basements and in their garages, and they just sent me home with like all this musty paperwork that I'm just kind of digging through and hopefully saving from rotting. And so again, that stuff that I'm kind of just going through. This is an interesting picture. As you can tell from all of the pictures I've showed you, this is a very white focused study. There were not a lot of African Americans within the spiritualist movement, and those that were ended up kind of breaking off in the 1870s. There's a couple of books on Black spiritualists, particularly in Louisiana, if you're interested in looking into that. But this kind of mainstream movement is very segregated. And so segregated that Lilydale, New York, recently just had its first Black medium last summer. Like that was the first time that that anybody could tell that a Black medium had spoken in Lilydale, New York. And looking through newspapers and things like that, I found that Carrie Twing, when she's down in Florida in 1903 through 1910, she does a lot of preaching at a Black Methodist church in Cassadaga, Florida. And so there's just kind of snippets of newspaper items of people talking about Carrie Twing's outreach to African Americans in Cassadaga and kind of some cross-pollination of ideas there. Again, still very open-ended. And then I'm given this picture the other day, and lo and behold, there are some African Americans in this picture, and none of them are labeled on the label thing, of course. So I have no idea who they are. The man number 14, who's at the top staring away, he's one of the clerks. So, somebody suggested, well, perhaps the African Americans in this picture are porters, but I mean, if clerk is labeled, but then they're not, but then he's looking away and everybody else is looking at the front. Carrie is number 9 there, standing prominently next to an African-American man, number 8, but he's not labeled. So again, just a thread to pull on. I don't know what's going on here. Could be nothing, but I have a lot to dig into, so to speak. So here's just a list of places I've been this year. Took a bunch of trips to University of Rochester with all of their Susan B. Anthony papers. Only found Watson and Twing mentioned like once or twice. So again, kind of talking about that lack of them being mentioned in the suffrage papers. Spent a lot of time at Cornell going through the Grange stuff, Huntington Library in Pasadena, California, and then the University of California, Berkeley. I found a lot of stuff on Watson. Also San Francisco Public Library, and then the California State Historical Society. That's where I found the unpublished manuscript that Watson wrote. So hoping to get into that soon and maybe get some answers there. Took a trip down to Casadega, and I keep getting random kind of packages in the mail of people that I met there. They'll find something and they'll mail it to me. So, hopefully that kind of keeps coming. Of course, Library of Congress and all of their suffrage papers. The Lilydale Library in Lilydale, New York, still very helpful to me. I'm going to be going to Columbia, I think next week, to look at their New York State suffrage papers. And then again, just digital sources have been really great. New York State Historic Newspapers is an awesome resource, and that's really helped me. Like the Westfield Republican really was good about keeping track of twing, so that's been a nice way to kind of fill in some of the gaps. The International Association for the Preservation of Spiritualist and Occult Periodicals is an amazing website, and they are digitizing all of the like newspapers that spiritualists were putting out and things like that. So that's an excellent resource. Of course, Hathi Trust, every time I go in there, I find something new. And even Google Books, right? I'm able to find Twing's books on there. So those have been very helpful in kind of piecing together this growing story. So that's what I have. So I will stop talking now and open it up.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the wonderful presentation and for sharing your work at this kind of research stage of what you're working on. I love your phrase, pulling threads on things. And but I hope you won't do any spiritual medium to try to uncover anything in your sources, although you could, I suppose, given the topic. If you have a question for Elizabeth, you can put it in the Q&A function, and I will either call on you and ask you to unmute your microphone, or I can read the question for you. So please enter our questions there and note if you'd like me to call on you or not. And we'll go from there. It looks like we do have a question from Wendy Gordon. Wendy, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Go ahead.
I wasn't going to unmute, but I'll read it. I've written it. I'll read the question.
Go ahead.
All right. I'm wondering about any parallels that you see with Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's book about women's rights in the LDS Church after the migration to Utah. So I have a vague memory that women who supported polygamy were intentionally excluded from the mainstream suffrage movement. They were basically an embarrassment. And was there possibly something similar going on for the spiritualists?
So I'll answer that kind of in a two-parter. So Ulrich's book I have not read, and one of our readers for the Spiritualism place was Scott McBride, who does LDS history, and he has a fabulous book coming out about the burnt over district, and he was like, you got to read this book and you got to address this. So that is actually something that I do need to address. So in direct relation to your question, Wendy, I don't know. In relation to your question of were they an embarrassment? Like, yeah, I mean, that's what I'm trying to figure out, right? Like that's initially kind of gut reaction. I think that might be what's going on and why that they've been kind of written out of it. I mean, I'm thinking back to like Lisa Teltrott's myth of Seneca Falls, and Susan B. Anthony, burning papers in her backyard, of suffrage stories that don't go along with her kind of directed narrative of the movement. So that's definitely part of it. However, spiritualists are mentioned in history of women's suffrage, not a lot, but they're not maligned or anything like that. And Susan B. Anthony is going to Lilydale until her dying day, 1906, and then Anna Howard Shaw is going there up until 1914. So they definitely they didn't mind hanging out with them, right? I'm not saying that they were spiritualists themselves, but they definitely had friends there. So I don't know.
Right. Could it be more of a retroactive exclusion that the historians think they're weirdos, but the actual suffragists didn't mind?
Yeah, no, I mean I think so, perhaps. And I think it's a question that, yeah, I'm asking and trying to figure out. And I actually kind of, in the chapter I wrote for Spiritualism's Place, I kind of threw that out at the end of the chapter, and then one of the readers was like, that's too loaded, like you can't just throw that out there and walk away. And I was like, yeah, you're right. So like I mean, honestly, that's something I'm pulling on and trying to figure out. Or I mean, both the historians thinking they're weirdos, and also just the kind of ickiness about religion in general, which I'm also grappling with, of this really being a history of religion, and having my own ickiness about working with religion, so trying to work through that as I'm unraveling all of this. Like they're definite questions that I'm like grappling with and asking as I move forward, and I think will really kind of lead the work. Like I think you're kind of getting at one of the central questions, to be honest, Wendy.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Wendy. Morag Martin, hi Morag, has a question that she asked for me to read. And she was curious how many spiritualists were involved in the feminist movement, i.e. were most actually not that political.
So during the like 1860s, the only people that are talking about women's rights are spiritualists, because everybody else is talking about the war, everybody else is talking about abolition and emancipation, and spiritualist newspapers are one of the few places where women's rights and women's autonomy and women's equality within the bonds of marriage are being actively discussed with, kind of a fervor. So not all spiritualists, or not all feminists are spiritualists, but all spiritualists are feminists. And I'm using feminists kind of like the timeline is not right there, but all spiritualists are promoting of women's rights, because you can't be a spiritualist, a practicing spiritualist, and believe in the hierarchy of ownership of another person, because that kind of goes against this idea of the body being one's own. It's that Quaker kind of inner light, right? Like you own the light and the spirit that spirit and God connect through you, and so nobody can own that. And so if you if you don't adhere to that, then you're not really a spiritualist, so to speak.
Thanks, and thanks for the question, Marg. Anne McPherson has a question. Anne, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I'm not sure if I can see it anymore. Yes, I can. All right. So I am not a US historian, and I don't know this historiography at all, but I am wondering if spiritualism and women's rights activism had a common root in an impulse to challenge established institutions like established churches, and laws like that, banning women from voting. And I'm also wondering if the death toll of the Civil War and the desire to connect with people who had died in the war played any sort of role in the perpetuation of all of this in the 1860s and 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. So Phelps, who I mentioned earlier, she wrote the book Gates Ajar. So her book is kind of the quintessential like Civil War reaching to the beyond to a dead loved one that's died in the war. So absolutely, the massive amounts of casualties, the massive amounts of mourning women, are looking for ways to answer their grief, right? To deal with their grief. And so spiritualism, seances, mediums becomes very much a popular both parlor game, but also way to connect that kind of grief, right? And it's also rising up with the rise of mass-produced material culture, right? So you now have mass-produced mourning clothes, right, that are going with trends of the season, and the Delineator magazine is telling you how you should, acquire your morning clothes and how you should wear your morning clothes. And yes, that's coming from like an older generation, but it's now kind of going into this mass consumption of material goods, right? Pictures are now something that people can purchase fairly inexpensively, right? And so they're commissioning, both living and post-mortem photographs of their loved ones, right? And then, of course, child mortality is super high, and again, kind of coinciding with this way to express one's grief in public, right? Through mourning garb, and through the purchase of, mourning brooches and things that one can actually have and hold. So this definitely, it goes along with all of that. It's part of a culture of mourning, a culture of consuming mourning, and kind of grappling and understanding and trying to understand, why this pain is happening in a way to alleviate it, so to speak. So it is very much a very feminine type of public mourning, and women who are inviting mediums into their houses and who are holding seances. Again, it's coming into kind of the private sphere to to mourn with other people, right? So of course, Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, famously has, seances, to try to speak to her son Willie, and then to Abraham Lincoln later in life. But she's one of many who are kind of engaging in this. I don't know, I think I lost your thread there, but I mean, the answer is yes. I could talk about mourning culture all day long. So
thanks for that interesting question. Clearly, the specter of the Civil War looms large here.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay. So I did lost my train of thought, right? But like Ward Phelps, right, wrote The Gates Ajar. Again, one of the best-selling novels of the 19th century. It's all about spiritualism, all about reaching over to the other side to her dead brother. She is one of a big major funder of the women's rights movement into the later 19th century, right? Like that money that she makes from that spiritualist book, kind of funds the movement, right? So I mean, there's those ties there too, like of the business end of it, so to speak.
Nice work tying into Kevin Sheets' question, which has to do with the business of mediumship. Kevin, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Such a cool topic. You mentioned a number of times kind of the idea of the circuit, and you did just sort of invoke some ideas about consumerism and the sort of culture of mourning within the materiality of that. And so I'm curious, because I'm thinking about like phrenology. I'm working on phrenology, and that very much had a commercial dimension to it, of course, right? And the Fowlers, who were sort of pioneers in phrenology, they had sort of franchises. They would train people and then send them out on the same kind of circuit, right, to do phrenological readings, and they have their publications and the busts that they sold. It doesn't sound like mediumship is sort of that in going to that extreme, but I wonder what kind of sort of commercialized structure existed to support the mediums, particularly in their circuits as they're traveling around. And you mentioned that they were often going to camps, but they're also doing private readings in homes. So like, what do you know, like what the conduct of their work was? Was there like a known circuit that you're going to hit Schenectady and then Albany, and then is there sort of a known path, and was there like booking agents and just business of mediumship?
So it's a big business, and which is also rife for a lot of fraud and swindlers, right? So I mean, It's a big question. Yes, there's a circuit, yes, there's certain places that you go. You're gonna, have your rate or whatever, either for private readings or public readings. There are definitely conversations going on in spiritualist newspapers about the, propriety of charging, right? Like, isn't this a gift? Shouldn't this be, this is spirit coming through, this is God's word, or our loved ones, why should we have to pay for this? And of course there are people who are saying, well, most of these mediums are women, right? And this is a way for them to support themselves, right? And they are working, right? So they need to be paid accordingly. But of course, then there's people like, there's the Bangs sisters who are doing like these portraits, and there like there's all kinds of also really shady people who are doing shady business, and of course making people like Twing and Watson, who I think are being honest about what they're experiencing, look bad, right? Because there are people who are getting caught, like, knocking on doors and windows. And then of course, like the Fox sisters later denounce that they say they were making that all up, and then later come back and say, no, we are actually paid to say that. They're struggled with alcohol for their later life, so that it's an important thing to discuss and to dive into, because it's always kind of the elephant in the room, right? Like people are paying to be entertained, and so what are the kind of ethical implications of that, right? Like, this is something that people are making their money on. And so places like Lilydale and even Cassadaga, they make laws. So Lilydale eventually banned all physical mediumships, right? So you couldn't have like trumpets floating around the room anymore, or use spirit cabinets or anything like that, because the fraud was just too high with those things. So they're trying to kind of counteract that. But it's definitely something that's like in the papers, like what's the ethical conundrum here of like charging for this. And so as far as like franchising and things like that, sure, there are like Victoria Woodhull's dad, dragged her around when she was a little girl as a medium as well. And so there's a lot of kind of taking advantage of young women. Coral Richmond, who's a famous medium, is married like 7 times or something, and one of her husbands is supposed to be kind of taking advantage of her. So there's all kinds of questions of like ownership and charging and gender, and I don't really have a good straight answer for you. But I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there is a book that's been written. I think she mostly looks at English mediums, but kind of about like the charging and the spectacle, and kind of getting more into like phrenology and how does that go into kind of other like almost sideshow type things.
It's good you mentioned England, because Ryan Irwin had a question that he asked for me to read, which had to do with your mention of the trip to Australia.
Yeah.
So,
I'd love to know more about it too, Ryan.
Ryan wanted to know if you had any kind of, what's the international story of spiritualism and suffrage, if you've been able to kind of think about that, or the transnational dimensions of the history.
So there definitely is a transnational element to it, particularly with British suffragists. There's this, oh gosh, I'm going to get this wrong, but there is W.T. Stead. He wrote the Babylon expose. He dies on the Titanic. I'm sorry, I'm like blanking, but he's like a kind of a famous journalist at the time. He starts this, he gets with some British suffragists, and they start this thing called Julia's Bureau, which Julia is a deceased British suffragist who starts speaking through, oh my God, I'm getting it wrong, and I'm sorry I'm butchering it, maybe somebody knows, but starts speaking through somebody. And so people can write into Julia's Bureau and kind of get answers through there, but like while also, you know, promoting women's rights and suffrage and equality of the sexes. So there's definitely cross promotion going on there. And then as far as like the Australia, I don't know. Like when I find something mentioned, it's like she went to Australia, and then I find this thing, Stanford was a spiritualist and he went to Australia, but like I don't know anything about it. And granted, I haven't like spent hours and hours and hours like digging on that one little thing, but it's not like readily just available to me. So it's something I have to figure out. But spiritualism, particularly in the Western world, is a phenomenon that's a Western phenomenon in the 19th century. You know, like people are digging it. And the fact that it breaks down these hierarchies, these social structure hierarchies, lends itself to equality of the sexes.
Not just a U.S. phenomenon.
Not just a U.S. phenomenon.
Out
Correct.
to the rest of the world, but
Yeah.
happening in multiple places.
Yeah.
There's an anonymous question, question here, and I'm not sure who made it. I'm glad to read it, but if you're the person who asked this question and would want to unmute and ask it, please go ahead. And maybe not, since you wrote it anonymously. So I'll ask the question. It's kind of a big question, Elizabeth, but to what degree have historians of U.S. religion written about the U.S. women's rights movement, even if they haven't paid attention to spiritualism? So it's a kind of question about, like, I suppose, what's surrounding your focus on this connection between suffrage and spiritualism from the religious perspective.
Right. I mean, it's definitely part of the historiography. I'm not going to say that more cannot be done. I mean, like Ulrich has written about, Mormon women and kind of suffrage, Black women and religion and women's rights is, of course, a very important topic to that historiography. But there can definitely be more, for sure. And I think, again, that like when I came to this, when I was going through comps and things like that, I was actually not interested in suffrage at all. I thought it was like so boring, but I was so interested in reform movements and maternalism. And so like that's kind of where I came in, and I was thinking of them as like really two different things. And because I think that that's kind of the way this historiography has kind of set these things up as. There's suffrage, there's reform, and there's religion. And of course, when you get into it, you realize that they're all in one, like, I mean, take the Women's Christian Temperance Union for an example, right? Like that is a Protestant Christian organization that's working for a reform movement, temperance, i.e., it's domestic violence, right? Like they want men to stop drinking so they stop beating the crap out of their wives, right? Like that's really what it is. And of course, they can't do that without the Do Everything campaign, the Get the Vote campaign, right? So it's like all of those three things like put into one, but yet we really talk about them in these kind of silos. So yes, there's work on this. It's a historiography that I'm, still trying to dig into. But of course, more can definitely be worked on. And, and I've seen it kind of thrown around, and I get the sense as well that, particularly kind of the secularism of academia has not helped that, right, in talking about religion and reform movements and things like women's rights. And so, yeah, there's definitely more work to be done on that, for sure.
I think Kevin has a follow-up, Kevin, about, I guess was the second part of your question about the relationship between spiritualism and the rise of psychology as a field.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Go ahead, though. Did you want to elaborate? Or?
Well, I mean, yeah, that was the question, because I remember thinking or reading, William James, was, obviously psychology, right? But I think some psychologists were often sort of like vaguely embarrassed by him because he also dabbled in like psychic research, right? There was a whole, I forgot the name of the professional organization, but he was like a president of that organization. And I think there was a lot of, pushback and like cringiness when like real quote unquote real psychologists recognized that James is like doing this sort of seancey kinds of stuff, and that was sort of embarrassing. But he also I think his wife was really interested in spiritualism, and I have some vague memory that he was they had sort of a plan that if one of them died first, that they were going to try to come back and like communicate or something. Anyway, so my question really is just about, thinking in terms of the periodization. You mentioned the 1870s is this moment when like, we're seeing a decline in spiritualism, and that's kind of when your story's sort of picking up. But there's also this sort of rise of psychology. And so what is happening to spiritualism when the, sort of quote unquote scientific psychology is emerging?
Right. I mean, they're definitely being put through more tests. So like UB does this famous kind of tests on some spiritualists. But honestly, I don't know the answer to that. Like, that's just not a thread I've necessarily pulled on, and it's a good question to ask. I mean, I think it probably gets into a larger question of like the professionalization of medicine, right? And just the rise of the professional in general, and who has power over, what is right and what is wrong, right? What is real and what is not? What are you experiencing and what is a hallucination, kind of thing. So definitely just something to think about, chew on.
I think back to some of the work on the, sort of the crisis of authority that's emerging in this period,
right?
Many different ways, and the opportunities, then the challenges to the existing order.
Right.
Kevin, were you going to follow up with something? I didn't want to interrupt you. Okay. I had one last question for you, Elizabeth, and then we can let you rest a bit since you've been concentrating a long time. Which I guess actually two connected questions, partly because I don't know this time period as well, but in terms of the periodization, are the 1870s and a time when suffrage is kind of a little off the table? I mean, doesn't it kind of fade as an issue a bit and then return again a few decades later? Or is it really kind of a thread? I'm asking in a sense about the suffrage part of what you're interested in relationship to spiritualism.
Yeah. So they have this phrase of the doldrums or whatever. You've got two different organizations working in the 1870s. They split over the 14th and the 15th Amendments. And so you have one group of people who are, working kind of like on a state by state basis. You have another group of people who are working for, a national referendum, so to speak. But really, it's kind of state by state, right? And so the individual kind of state parties are really doing a lot of the work. And so, when you're looking at like New York State, you're more looking into the early. I mean, really, it's like the 1890s when you really start seeing like things kind of coming to like the state legislature. So 1893 is like a huge suffrage year in New York State because they're trying to get a referendum in 1894, right? 1896 is a big one for California. So I don't want to say no, it disappears, because it doesn't. It just looks different, right? There are people pounding the pavement, so to speak, to do this, but it looks a little different, right? It's more kind of tied up with the WCTU, with temperance, with kind of overall marriage equality and property rights, not necessarily trying to get state legislatures to change their votes yet. That momentum really comes in the 1890s.
And just to follow up on that with a couple of things you made me think about. One is a little more theoretical, I suppose, but is there a connection about this idea of mediumship in terms of the way this is a kind of an observation that I wonder if is interesting to you. Is there a connection between kind of political medium, like a representative that you elect who represents the voice of you politically in the state, and this kind of medium from the other world, from the dead, what is this idea of the mediumship part of it seems so crucial to this connection on a kind of more theoretical level. Is that something that seems interesting to you or too far-fetched?
I mean, it's not something I've thought of, only because I think that's the switch really that kind of I'm dealing with in the historiography, and Brady was kind of dealing with, that before the 1870s, the mediumship for a woman is the only way that she can speak. Right. But after that, she can speak as a full-fledged human being for her own rights. So she doesn't need Abraham Lincoln to come through her, right, and tell these men what's up, right? Like, she can speak saying, I am a full sentient human being. Yes, spirit talks to me, but I'm going to talk to you now about spiritualism's role in supporting women's rights as me, kind of thing. So I guess I just haven't thought about it as like a politician being kind of a mouthpiece for a larger movement, because by the time I'm looking at it, these women are not using their mediumship as a crutch to have authority. They have authority through themselves.
And I'm just wondering if maybe that connects back to some of the crises in Protestantism in particular at the time about, kind of these questions of who's getting to speak and on whose behalf people are getting to speak, just kind of thinking out loud. But it does seem like this question of being a medium is so core to the spiritualist, the assertion of spiritualism as something that women could take hold of and wield. So that it's interesting to think about that. And I suppose it is more in this kind of cultural studies theoretical world of trying to theorize what exactly political representation is in the same way, which could be interesting when you think about suffrage. Yeah.
Something to think about.
Is there something crucial about the rural dimension of the story in New York State? And then that was my last thing that I was wondering about from what you presented.
Yeah, that's another thread I'm pulling on, because particularly Twing is so integral to the Grange. And so, got into this whole historiography of the Grange that I just really was kind of unaware of. I always thought of the Grange as kind of this, I don't know, kind of rising up from the South, not really being a Northeastern thing, but then getting into the historiography and realizing there's kind of two movements of the Grange, and Carrie is very much part of this second rise of the Grange that is like the 1880s, 1890s, when it's very strong and popular in the Northeast. I always thought of them as kind of these rabble rousers of like Elizabeth Lease and, raise more hell and less corn kind of thing. And that is not at all what I'm finding in any of the documents. It's very much farming, like the notes and the minutes, in meeting after meeting after meeting are they're not political whatsoever. So I mean, to get back to your question, I mean, again, it's I thought for me, I'm kind of interested because Carrie is a famous spiritualist, being a leader in a very rural, what we would consider conservative environment, and the fact that she is not chastised for it at all, is interesting to me. And again, it's just a question that I keep asking, right? Like, same with the suffrage, right? Like she's headlining with Deborah Blake and Susan B. Anthony, right? But there's no secret that she's writing books as some, guy that died 20 years ago, right? Like that's maybe a little weird to us, right? And nobody seems to blink an eye at it. I only found one instance where a WCTU meeting, a woman balked that they had invited Carrie to come speak at their meeting because she thought it was anti-Christian. And then the rest of the group said, no, not at all. Spiritualists are very, Protestant adjacent, right? Like they believe in God, they just believe in God and, and that was so far, that's the only thing I've ever seen where she got any kind of pushback whatsoever. So, I don't know. I lost your question, but
No, that I think there's something to there's something about this.
the rural thing. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's just something I'm digging into, and it's a question that's on my mind. I don't really have a good answer for you, but the fact that they didn't think it was weird.
That seems important.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you to those of you who've attended. Some people had to drop out. That's fine. Just a reminder that the next webinar will be April 25th, 5 to 7 p.m. Beyond the City, Replacing the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in New York State and Beyond, with Dr. Kevin Sheets, who, thank you for joining us today, Kevin, and Dr. Randy Storch will be kind of leading the way, along with some other SUNY faculty involved in this project, kind of keeping us in this same time period. In May, we will be moving to Haudenosaunee history and Native American history, and then in June, a focus on civil rights with Corey Graves and her work on that topic. So please register at the link if you're interested in joining us and you haven't yet. And we just want to thank everyone, and especially thank you to Dr. Masarik for sharing your work at this early stage and having a good conversation about it. We really appreciate that.
Thank you for the questions, everybody. Just good food for thought.
And please join us again about a month from now. We'll see you then.